Some say the desert keeps secrets better than any man ever could. But in the summer of 1887, one lonely rancher discovered that the harshest land in America would bring him the most unexpected gift of his lifetime. What happened when 10 desperate Apache souls stumbled onto his property would change everything he believed about enemies, about family, and about what it truly means to be human. This is not just a story of survival. This is a story of how two worlds, taught to hate each other, learned to see the humanity hiding beneath the fear. The sun was setting over the Arizona territory, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The land stretched out in every direction, dry and unforgiving, dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like silent guards watching over the empty miles. In the middle of this vast wilderness sat a small ranch house made of adobe and rough timber. Smoke rose gently from its chimney, the only sign of life for many miles around. Inside that house lived a man named Thomas Clearwater. He was 53 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His hair had turned gray at the temples, and his hands were rough and calloused from decades of hard work. Thomas had lived on this ranch for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, he had spoken to another human being perhaps a dozen times each year, if that. Thomas had not always been a solitary man. Once, long ago, he had been different. He had been a husband and a father. He had known the sound of laughter echoing through a home, the warmth of a woman sleeping beside him, the joy of watching children grow. But that was before the fever came. That was before death visited his small farm in Missouri and took everything that mattered to him in the span of 3 terrible weeks. His wife, Margaret, had been the first to fall ill. Thomas remembered how she had complained of a headache one morning, how he had told her to rest while he worked the fields. By evening, she was burning with fever. By the 3rd day, she could not recognize his face. She died on the 5th day, calling out for her mother in a voice that Thomas would hear in his nightmares for years to come. The children went next. Little Samuel, who was only 7 years old and loved to chase butterflies through the tall grass. Then Mary, who was 10 and had her mother's kind eyes. Thomas had buried them himself, digging 3 graves in the hard Missouri earth while tears streamed down his face, and his body shook with grief he could not contain. After that, Thomas could not stay. The farm that had once been filled with life had become a graveyard to him. Every corner held a memory. Every sound reminded him of voices that would never speak again. So he sold everything he owned, packed what little he needed onto a horse, and headed west. He was not running toward anything. He was running away from the ghosts that haunted his every waking moment. For years, Thomas drifted. He worked on cattle drives, pushing herds of longhorns up the trails from Texas to Kansas. He spent time in mining camps, swinging a pickaxe in the dark tunnels of Colorado. He hired himself out as a farmhand, a carpenter, a fence builder, anything that would keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. But no matter where he went or what he did, the emptiness followed him. It was not until he reached the Arizona territory that Thomas finally stopped moving. There was something about this harsh, unforgiving land that spoke to him. The desert did not pretend to be kind. It did not offer false comfort or empty promises. It simply existed, brutal and honest, demanding that anyone who wished to survive within its borders earn that survival through sweat and determination. Thomas found a piece of land that no one else wanted. It was far from any town, at least 3 days' ride from the nearest settlement. Water was scarce, but he discovered a small spring that bubbled up from deep underground, enough to sustain a modest herd of cattle and a few horses. He built his house with his own hands, cutting timber from the mountains to the north and making adobe bricks from the red earth beneath his feet. In the beginning, he had kept some contact with the outside world. Once every few months, he would ride to the nearest trading post to sell cattle and buy supplies. But as the years passed, even those trips became less frequent. Thomas found that he preferred the silence of the desert to the noise of other people. He preferred the company of his horses and his dog to the conversations of men who always seemed to want something from him. By the time 15 years had passed, Thomas had become something of a legend in the scattered settlements of the territory. People spoke of the hermit rancher who lived alone in the wilderness, the man who had turned his back on civilization. Some said he was crazy. Others said he was hiding from the law. The truth was simpler and sadder than any of their stories. Thomas was simply a man who had lost too much and had decided that the safest way to protect his heart was to keep it far from anyone who might break it again. Thomas had developed a routine over the years, a rhythm to his days that rarely changed. He woke before dawn, when the sky was still dark and the stars were fading. He would build a fire, heat water for coffee, and eat a simple breakfast of biscuits and dried meat. Then, he would tend to his animals, checking on the horses in the corral and counting his cattle to make sure none had wandered off in the night. His herd was small, perhaps 30 head of cattle at any given time. It was enough to provide him with meat and enough to trade when he needed supplies. He did not care about building wealth or expanding his holdings. He needed only enough to survive, and the desert provided that much if a man was willing to work for it. After the morning chores were done, Thomas would often ride out across his land, checking the fences he had built to keep predators away from his livestock. The territory was home to mountain lions and wolves, and they were always looking for an easy meal. Thomas had learned to track them, to read the signs they left behind in the dust and the scrub brush. He had killed a few over the years, when they had come too close to his herd, but mostly he simply watched them from a distance, respecting their right to exist in this harsh land just as he existed. The afternoons were for maintenance and repair. There was always something that needed fixing on a ranch. A fence post that had rotted through. A section of the corral that needed reinforcing. The roof of the house that leaked when the rare rains came. Thomas had become skilled at many trades over his years of solitude. He could work leather and wood, could shoe his own horses and tan hides. Self-sufficiency was not just a choice for him. It was a necessity. In the evenings, Thomas would sit on the porch of his house and watch the sun go down. His dog, a gray-muzzled hound he called Shadow, would lie at his feet. Together they would watch the colors change across the sky, listen to the coyotes begin their nightly chorus, feel the heat of the day give way to the cool of the desert night. These were the moments when Thomas felt something close to peace. Not happiness exactly. He was not sure he remembered what happiness felt like. But something quieter, something gentler. Acceptance, perhaps. The understanding that this was his life now, and that it would remain this way until he died. Thomas had long ago made peace with death. He did not fear it. Some nights, when the loneliness pressed in especially hard, he almost welcomed the thought of it. He imagined joining Margaret and the children wherever they had gone. He imagined seeing their faces again, hearing their voices. But something always held him back from that final step. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the simple animal instinct to survive. Or maybe, deep down, there was still some small spark of hope that he could not quite extinguish. The summer of 1887 began like any other. The days grew longer and hotter, the sun beating down from a sky that seemed made of white-hot metal. Thomas spent more time in the shade during the middle hours, conserving his strength for the cooler parts of the day. His cattle clustered around the spring, seeking relief from the heat. Even the wildlife seemed to slow down, the lizards and snakes staying hidden until the shadows grew long. It was during one of these hot, still afternoons that Thomas first noticed something unusual. He was sitting on his porch, repairing a bridle that had begun to fray, when Shadow suddenly lifted his head and growled. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his nose working the air. Thomas set down his work and reached for the rifle that always leaned against the wall beside him. Years of living alone in the wilderness had taught Thomas to trust his instincts and the instincts of his animals. Shadow had sensed danger before Thomas could detect anything himself more times than he could count. The dog had warned him of approaching mountain lions, of rattlesnakes coiled in the shade, of flash floods rumbling down from the distant mountains. Whatever Shadow had noticed now, it was worth paying attention to. Thomas stood and walked to the edge of the porch, shading his eyes against the glare of the sun. The land stretched out before him, shimmering with heat waves that made everything in the distance dance and blur. For a long moment, he saw nothing but the familiar landscape he had looked upon for 15 years. Then he saw them. At first, they were just dark shapes on the horizon, wavering in the heat like mirages. Thomas squinted, trying to make out what they were. Deer, perhaps? Sometimes mule deer came down from the mountains in search of water during the driest months. Or maybe a group of wild horses, though he had not seen any in this area for years. As the shapes drew closer, Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. These were not animals. They were people, and from the way they were moving, slow and staggering, something was very wrong. Thomas debated what to do. Every instinct developed over his years of solitude told him to go inside, bar the door, and wait for whoever this was to pass by. He wanted nothing to do with other people, wanted no part of their troubles or their needs. The world outside his ranch had brought him nothing but pain, He had built this life precisely to keep that world at a distance. But there was something about the way these figures were moving that he could not ignore. They were not walking. They were stumbling, some of them barely able to stay upright. As they came closer, Thomas could see that several of the smaller figures were being half-carried by the larger ones. Whatever had happened to these people, they were in desperate trouble. The cold knot in Thomas's stomach twisted tighter when he finally got a clear look at the approaching group. There were 10 of them in total, men and women and children. Their skin was dark, their hair black and long. They wore clothing he had seen before only from a distance, the distinctive dress of the Apache people who had lived in this land long before any white man had ever set foot in it. Thomas felt his grip tighten on his rifle. Like most white settlers in the Arizona Territory, he had grown up hearing stories about the Apache. Terrifying stories of raids and massacres, of settlements burned to the ground and families slaughtered without mercy. The Apache wars had raged for decades, and even now, in 1887, the fighting had only recently begun to die down. The great chief Geronimo had surrendered just the year before, but everyone knew that not all the Apache had given up their resistance. Small bands still roamed the wilderness, and encounters between them and white settlers rarely ended peacefully. Every fiber of Thomas's being screamed at him to raise his rifle, to fire warning shots, to make it clear that these people were not welcome on his land. That was what any sensible man would do. That was what survival demanded. But Thomas did not raise his rifle. Instead, he found himself watching as the group came closer, close enough now that he could see their faces clearly. What he saw stopped him cold. These were not warriors coming to attack his ranch. These were refugees fleeing something terrible. The adults among them were gaunt and exhausted, their eyes hollow with a weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue. Several of them bore wounds, rough bandages wrapped around arms and legs, stained dark with dried blood. And the children, 4 of them, ranging from perhaps 5 years old to 12, clung to the adults with the wide-eyed terror of young ones who had seen things no child should ever see. The group stopped about 50 yards from Thomas's porch. They had seen him standing there with his rifle, and they knew as well as he did what that usually meant. For a long moment, no one moved. The hot wind blew dust across the gap between them, and Shadow continued to growl low in his throat. Then, one of the Apache men stepped forward. He was older than the others, perhaps close to Thomas's own age, with gray streaks in his long black hair. He moved slowly, carefully, making sure his hands were visible and empty. When he spoke, his voice was rough and tired, but his English was clear. "We mean no harm," he said. "We ask only for water. Then, we will go." Thomas studied the man's face, looking for any sign of deception. He had lived long enough to know that desperation could drive people to do terrible things, and these people were clearly desperate. But what he saw in the Apache man's eyes was not the look of someone planning violence. It was the look of a man who had already lost almost everything and was simply trying to save what little remained. Behind the older man, Thomas could see one of the women swaying on her feet. A young man beside her was holding her up, and Thomas could see that his arm was wrapped in bloody bandages. One of the children, a little girl who could not have been more than 5 or 6, had stopped crying only because she no longer had the strength for tears. Her face was slack with exhaustion and thirst, her lips cracked and dry. Thomas felt something stir inside him, something he had thought long dead. It was a feeling he recognized from a lifetime ago, from before the fever, from before the graves he had dug with his own hands. It was the feeling of caring about something other than his own survival. He lowered his rifle. "Water's in the spring, behind the house," Thomas heard himself say. "There's shade there too. You can rest." The Apache man's face showed no expression, but something in his eyes shifted. Relief, perhaps. Or maybe just surprised that this white man was not going to shoot them where they stood. "Thank you," the man said simply. Thomas watched as the group made their way slowly around his house toward the spring. Several of them could barely walk, and the others supported them as best they could. Thomas did not follow immediately. He stood on his porch, his rifle still in his hands, and asked himself what he had just done. He had invited 10 Apaches onto his property, 10 members of a people who had been at war with white settlers for as long as anyone could remember. 10 strangers about whom he knew nothing except that they were desperate enough to approach a white man's ranch and ask for help. Every practical part of Thomas's mind told him he was a fool. Even if these particular Apaches meant him no harm, others might come looking for them. Soldiers might come looking for them too, and soldiers tended to shoot first and ask questions later when it came to Apache. By offering these people refuge, Thomas might be signing his own death warrant. But, as he stood there watching the group disappear around the corner of his house, Thomas realized that he did not care. For the first time in 15 years, something other than routine and survival mattered to him. For the first time in 15 years, he had the chance to help someone, to be something other than a lonely man waiting to die in the desert. Thomas set his rifle against the wall and walked after his unexpected guests. Whatever happened next, he would face it. He had run from the world for long enough. Maybe it was time to see if there was still something human left inside him after all. The spring behind Thomas's house was a small oasis in the harsh desert landscape. Water bubbled up from deep underground, forming a pool perhaps 10 feet across before flowing away in a small stream that disappeared back into the earth a few hundred yards distant. Over the years, Thomas had encouraged the growth of cottonwood trees and willows around the spring, providing shade and greenery that stood in stark contrast to the surrounding brown and gray of the desert. When Thomas reached the spring, he found the Apaches gathered around the water's edge. Some of them were drinking deeply, scooping water with cupped hands and bringing it to their parched lips. Others were helping the wounded and the weakest among them to sit in the shade. The little girl Thomas had noticed earlier was lying with her head in a woman's lap, her eyes closed, barely conscious. Thomas stood at a distance, watching them drink. He did not approach too closely, not wanting to cause alarm. But he also did not leave. Some instinct told him that these people needed more than just water, and he found himself wanting to help in whatever way he could. The older Apache man who had spoken earlier finished drinking and rose to his feet. He walked over to where Thomas stood, moving slowly enough to show that he posed no threat. When he reached Thomas, he stopped and met his eyes directly. "My name is DeSoto, he said. In your language, it means he goes out at dawn." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm Thomas. Thomas Clearwater." DeSoto studied him for a moment, his dark eyes taking in the gray-haired white man who had offered help to people he had every reason to fear and hate. "Why do you help us?" DeSoto asked. "You know who we are? You know what your people say about us?" It was a fair question, and Thomas found himself struggling to answer it. Why was he helping them? He had spent 15 years avoiding human contact, building walls between himself and the world. Why now, of all times, was he opening his door to strangers? "I've seen enough death in my life," Thomas finally said. "I'm not interested in causing more." DeSoto was quiet for a moment, processing this answer. Then he nodded slowly. "You have lost people," he said. It was not a question. Thomas felt the old familiar pain twist in his chest. "A long time ago. Loss never truly goes away," DeSoto said. "It just becomes part of who we are." The two men stood in silence for a moment, two strangers from vastly different worlds, connected by the universal experience of grief. Then, Thomas shook himself and gestured toward the wounded members of the group. "Those wounds need tending," he said. "I've got some supplies in the house. Clean bandages, medicine. It's not much, but it might help." DeSoto's eyebrows rose slightly. "You would share your medicine with us?" "Wouldn't do me much good to let you drink from my spring, and then watch you die of infection," Thomas said gruffly. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed DeSoto's face. "You are a strange man, Thomas Clearwater." "I've been told that before," Thomas replied. He turned and walked back toward his house to gather supplies. Behind him, he could hear DeSoto speaking to the others in their own language. Thomas did not understand the words, but he could hear the tone shifting from tension to something closer to cautious relief. As he entered his house and began gathering bandages and the small bottle of carbolic acid he used for wounds, Thomas caught sight of himself in the small mirror that hung by his wash basin. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. There was something in his eyes that had not been there for a very long time. Not happiness, not yet, but something like purpose, something like being alive. Thomas shook his head at his own reflection. One morning of helping strangers, and already he was changing. He did not know whether that was good or bad. He only knew that when he had seen those desperate people stumbling toward his ranch, he had not been able to turn them away. Whatever came next, he would have to live with the consequences of that choice. He gathered the supplies into a bundle and headed back out to the spring. The Arizona sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and the first hints of evening coolness were touching the air. In a few hours, it would be dark, and Thomas would have to make another decision. Would he let these people stay the night? Would he offer them food as well as water and medicine? As he walked, Thomas realized that he already knew the answers to these questions. He had made his choice the moment he lowered his rifle. For better or worse, his life of solitude was about to change. The little girl by the spring had opened her eyes and was drinking water from a cup someone had fashioned from a folded leaf. Her color was already beginning to improve. Watching her, Thomas felt something he had not felt in 15 years. He felt hope. He did not know what the coming days would bring. He did not know how long these Apaches would stay or what dangers might follow them to his ranch. He did not know whether helping them would prove to be the wisest decision of his life or the most foolish. But, for the first time since burying his family in the Missouri earth, Thomas Clearwater did not feel completely alone. And that, perhaps, was worth any risk. The evening came slowly, as it always did in the Arizona summer. The sun seemed to hang on the horizon for hours, reluctant to surrender the sky to darkness. Thomas worked by that fading light, tending to the wounds of the injured Apache with hands that remembered skills he had not used in many years. The woman who had been swaying on her feet earlier was named Ishka. She was the wife of DeSoto, and she had been shot in the side. The bullet had passed through cleanly, leaving an entry wound and an exit wound, but the journey through the desert had allowed dirt and infection to set in. Thomas cleaned the wound as gently as he could, washing away the caked blood and applying the carbolic acid that would fight the infection. Ishka made no sound as he worked, though he knew the treatment must have been agonizing. She simply watched him with dark, steady eyes, accepting his help without comment. The young man with the wounded arm was named Goyakla. He was DeSoto's son, perhaps 25 years old, with the lean, muscular build of a warrior in his prime. His wound was less serious than Ishka's, a deep gash from a knife rather than a bullet, but it too had become infected during their flight. As Thomas cleaned and bandaged the wound, Goyakla spoke to him in halting English. "You have done this before," he said. "You have treated wounds." Thomas nodded without looking up from his work. "During the war, the big one, between the states, I served as a stretcher bearer for a while. Saw enough field surgery to learn the basics." "You were a soldier?" "For about 6 months. Then, I took a piece of shrapnel in my leg, and they sent me home." Thomas finished wrapping the bandage and secured it with a knot. "There. That should hold for now. I'll check it again in the morning." Goyakla flexed his arm experimentally, testing the bandage. "It is good," he said. "Thank you." Thomas just nodded and moved on to the next patient. There was an older woman named Benny Actony who had twisted her ankle badly during their flight, and a boy of about 12 named Nate who had cuts on his feet from running over rough ground without adequate protection. Thomas treated them all, one by one, as the light faded and the stars began to appear overhead. When he was finished, Thomas stood and looked at the group gathered by his spring. They were watching him with expressions he could not quite read. Wariness, certainly. These were people who had learned through bitter experience that white men could not be trusted. But there was something else too, something that might have been the beginning of gratitude. "You'll need food," Thomas said. "I've got some dried beef and beans in the house. It's not much, but it'll keep you going." DeSoto rose and approached him. "You have already done more than we could have asked. We cannot take your food as well." "You're not taking it. I'm offering it." Thomas met the older man's eyes. "Look, I don't know what happened to you or why you're running. That's your business. But I can see those children need to eat, and I've got more food than I need. So let's not argue about it." For a long moment, DeSoto simply looked at him. Then, slowly he nodded. "You are right. The children must eat. We accept your kindness, Thomas Clearwater, and we will not forget it." Thomas returned to the house and gathered food from his stores. He had plenty, more than enough to share. Living alone, he had developed the habit of keeping his larder well stocked, never knowing when weather or illness might keep him from replenishing his supplies. He loaded a sack with dried meat, beans, and some hard biscuits he had baked a few days earlier. On impulse, he added a jar of honey he had traded for at the trading post several months ago. The children might appreciate something sweet. When he returned to the spring, he found that the Apaches had arranged themselves for the night. The wounded and the children were in the center of the group, sheltered by the healthy adults who positioned themselves around the perimeter. It was a defensive formation, Thomas realized, the arrangement of people who expected danger even in their sleep. He distributed the food, watching as the adults parceled it out among the group. The children ate with the desperate hunger of those who had gone too long without proper nourishment. The little girl, whose name Thomas had learned was Lozan, named after a famous Apache warrior woman, devoured her portion so quickly that the woman caring for her had to tell her to slow down. Thomas retreated to his porch to give them privacy while they ate. Shadow lay at his feet, the old dog keeping watch on the strangers by the spring with the same alertness he showed when guarding against predators. Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears absently, his mind working over the situation he found himself in. He still did not know what had happened to these people. He could see that they had been attacked, that they had fled from something terrible, but the details remained a mystery. Part of him wanted to ask, to understand what he had gotten himself into. But another part recognized that they would tell him when they were ready, if they chose to tell him at all. After 15 years of guarding his own privacy, Thomas was not about to demand that others bare their souls to him. The night deepened, and, one by one, the Apaches settled down to sleep. DeSoto remained awake the longest, sitting apart from the others, and watching the darkness beyond the spring. He was standing guard, Thomas realized, protecting his people even in their exhaustion. Thomas watched him for a while, then made a decision. He rose from his porch and walked over to where DeSoto sat. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." DeSoto looked up at him, surprise evident in his face. "You would do this? My dog will wake me if anything approaches. He's got better senses than either of us." Thomas gestured toward Shadow, who had followed him from the porch and was now sitting alertly, ears pricked. "You've had a hard journey. You need rest more than I do." DeSoto was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's face in the starlight. Then he nodded slowly. "You are a good man, Thomas Clearwater. I did not expect to find such a man among your people." "There are good and bad among every people," Thomas replied. "I've learned that much in my years." DeSoto rose and moved to join his family. Before he lay down, he turned back to Thomas. "Tomorrow, I will tell you our story. You have earned that much." Thomas nodded and settled himself against a rock where he could watch both the sleeping Apaches and the darkness beyond. Shadow curled up beside him, and together they kept vigil through the long night hours. The desert night was full of sounds for those who knew how to listen. The distant yipping of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the occasional hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. Thomas listened to these familiar sounds and found a strange comfort in them. For the first time in 15 years, he was not keeping watch only for himself. He was protecting something, someone, beyond his own lonely existence. As the night wore on, Thomas found his thoughts drifting to his family. Margaret, Samuel, Mary. He had tried so hard not to think of them over the years. Every memory was a wound that never quite healed, a reminder of everything he had lost. But, tonight, watching over these strangers who had stumbled into his life, the memories did not hurt quite so much. Tonight, they felt more like old friends than old enemies. He remembered Margaret's laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was amused. He remembered Samuel's endless questions about everything, his insatiable curiosity about the world. He remembered Mary's gentleness, the way she had cared for injured animals and brought them home to nurse back to health. What would they think if they could see him now? Would they be proud of him for helping these desperate people? Or would they be horrified that he had turned his back on the world for so long, hiding in the desert while life went on without him? Thomas had no answers to these questions. He only knew that something had changed inside him today, something fundamental. The walls he had built around his heart had cracked, and through those cracks, something was beginning to grow again. The first light of dawn was touching the eastern sky when DeSoto stirred and rose. He moved quietly, careful not to wake the others, and joined Thomas by the rock where he had kept watch all night. "You did not sleep," DeSoto observed. Thomas shrugged. "I'm used to short nights. Comes with living alone." DeSoto sat down beside him, and, for a while, neither man spoke. They watched the sunrise together, the sky shifting from black to gray to pink to gold. It was a beautiful sight, one that Thomas had witnessed thousands of times, but somehow it felt different this morning. More meaningful, more alive. "I promised to tell you our story," DeSoto said finally. "Are you ready to hear it?" Thomas turned to face him. "I'm listening." DeSoto was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had made peace with tragedy. "We were part of a larger group," he began. "Nearly 50 of us, living in the mountains to the north. We had surrendered to the soldiers 2 summers ago, when Geronimo gave himself up. We were promised that we would be sent to a reservation in New Mexico, where we could live in peace." Thomas nodded. He had heard stories about the Apache surrenders, about the promises made by the government. He had also heard stories about how those promises were rarely kept. For a while, things were as they had said, DeSoto continued. The reservation was not good land, but it was better than running. We could plant crops, raise livestock, live without the constant fear of soldiers hunting us. We began to build a new life. He paused, and Thomas could see the pain gathering in his eyes. Then, 3 weeks ago, the soldiers came again. They said there had been reports of trouble, of Apache leaving the reservation to raid settlements in the area. They said they had orders to move us again, to a place called Florida, far to the east. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard about the deportations to Florida. The government had decided that the safest way to deal with the Apache problem was to remove the Apache entirely from the Southwest, to send them to prisons on the other side of the country where they could pose no threat to white settlers. The conditions in those prisons were said to be terrible, and many of the Apache sent there never returned. We had done nothing wrong, DeSoto said, his voice bitter. We had kept every promise we made. But they did not care. They herded us like cattle, put us in wagons, and began moving us east. What happened? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. Some of our young men decided to fight. They attacked the soldiers guarding us, trying to free the rest of us. It did not go well. DeSoto's voice grew heavy with grief. Many were killed. The soldiers began shooting into the wagons, not caring who they hit. My brother was killed. 3 of our elders. 2 children who had seen no more than 10 summers. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling sick. He had seen enough violence in his life to know how quickly it could spiral out of control, how easily death could come for the innocent as well as the guilty. In the chaos, some of us managed to escape. 10 of us. We ran into the desert, hoping to disappear before the soldiers could follow. DeSoto gestured toward the sleeping forms by the spring. We have been running for 3 weeks. We have little food, no weapons except knives, no supplies. We knew we could not last much longer. When we saw your ranch, we thought we would ask for water and move on. We did not expect. He trailed off, and Thomas finished the thought for him. You didn't expect me to help you. No, DeSoto admitted. We did not. Thomas sat with this story for a long time, letting it sink in. 10 people, survivors of a massacre, running for their lives through the desert. No wonder they had looked so desperate when they approached his ranch. They were not just tired and thirsty. They were running from death itself. Where were you heading? Thomas asked finally. DeSoto shook his head. We did not know. South, into Mexico perhaps. There are Apache bands there that still live free. Or maybe into the mountains, where we could hide until the soldiers stopped looking for us. We had no real plan. We were simply trying to stay alive. Thomas looked out at the sunrise, thinking hard. These people were fugitives, wanted by the army. By helping them, he was putting himself in serious danger. If soldiers came looking and found Apaches on his property, they would not stop to ask questions. They would assume he was an enemy, perhaps even an accomplice to whatever crimes the Apache were accused of. At best, he would lose his ranch. At worst, he would lose his life. But, as he looked at the sleeping forms by the spring, at the children curled against their mothers, at the wounded trying to heal from injuries that should have killed them, Thomas could not bring himself to care about the risk. These were people, human beings, not the monsters that white settlers made the Apache out to be. They had been wronged, and they were suffering, and they needed help. You can stay here, Thomas heard himself say. At least until your wounded have healed, and you've regained your strength. I've got enough food and water for all of us. DeSoto stared at him, genuine shock on his face. You would take such a risk for us? You do not even know us. I know enough, Thomas replied. I know your people in trouble, and I know I'm not the kind of man who can turn away from that. For a long moment, DeSoto was silent. Then, he reached out and clasped Thomas's forearm in a grip that was surprisingly strong despite his exhaustion. You have our gratitude, Thomas Clearwater, and our loyalty. For as long as we stay on your land, we will help you in any way we can. We will work, we will hunt, we will do whatever is needed. You will not regret this kindness. Thomas nodded, uncomfortable with the intensity of the other man's gratitude. Just get some more rest. We'll figure out the details later. The day that followed was strange and busy. The Apaches woke gradually, and Thomas found himself surrounded by activity for the first time in years. The healthy adults immediately set about making themselves useful, as DeSoto had promised. Goyakla, despite his wounded arm, insisted on helping with the morning chores. He proved to be skilled with horses, calming and handling Thomas's animals with an ease that came from long experience. The women began organizing the campsite by the spring, creating a more permanent arrangement than the hasty shelter of the night before. They wove branches into windbreaks, gathered firewood, and set up a cooking area. Thomas watched with amazement at how efficiently they worked, transforming the area around his spring into something that almost resembled a small village. The children, once they had eaten and rested, proved to be curious and energetic. Little Lozan followed Thomas around like a shadow, watching everything he did with wide, fascinated eyes. The other children, a boy named Dakia who was about 10 and twin girls named Elope and Hakali who were 7, were more cautious, keeping their distance while still observing this strange white man who had taken them in. Thomas found himself speaking more in that single day than he had in the previous year combined. He explained how his ranch worked, showed the Apaches where the best grazing land was for the cattle, pointed out the places where predators were most likely to lurk. In return, they shared their own knowledge of the land, showing him plants he had never noticed that could be used for food or medicine, teaching him tracking techniques that put his own skills to shame. By evening, Thomas felt both exhausted and strangely exhilarated. His quiet, solitary life had been turned upside down in the span of 24 hours. Part of him mourned the loss of his peaceful routine, but a larger part, a part he had thought dead and buried, felt more alive than it had in 15 years. As the sun set and the group gathered for their evening meal, De Sotohay approached Thomas with a serious expression. "We need to speak of something," he said. "Something important." Thomas set aside his plate and gave the older man his full attention. "What is it?" "The soldiers who were taking us east," De Sotohay said slowly. "They will not have stopped looking for us. By now, they will have sent word to all the forts in the territory. There will be patrols searching for us." Thomas nodded. He had been thinking the same thing all day. "I figured as much. If they find us here, it will go badly for you as well as us. We do not want to bring trouble to a man who has shown us such kindness." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his options. He could tell the Apaches to leave, send them back into the desert to fend for themselves. It would be the safest choice, the choice that would protect his ranch and his life. But it was not a choice he could make. Not anymore. "There's a canyon about 2 miles north of here," Thomas said finally. "It's hidden, hard to find if you don't know where to look. The entrance is narrow, easy to defend if it comes to that. I've used it to shelter my cattle during bad storms. If soldiers do come looking, that might be a better place for you to hide." De Sotohay's eyes widened slightly. "You know of such a place, and you would share it with us?" "I'm not just sharing it," Thomas replied. "I'm suggesting we move there together. If soldiers find you on my property, it doesn't matter whether I'm with you or not. I'm already in this. Might as well see it through." The Apache leader studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. "You are full of surprises, Thomas Clearwater. I begin to think that fate led us to your ranch for a reason." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable, as always, with emotional displays. "I don't know about fate. I just know that those children deserve a chance to grow up, and I'd like to help make that happen." That night, Thomas lay in his own bed for the first time in 2 days, but sleep did not come easily. His mind was racing, planning, preparing for what lay ahead. They would need to move carefully, cover their tracks, make sure the canyon refuge was properly stocked with supplies. It would mean more work than Thomas had done in years, more responsibility, more risk. But, as he lay there in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people moving around his property, Thomas felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt needed. He felt purposeful. He felt like his life had meaning again beyond simply waiting to die. Outside his window, he could hear De Sotohay and Goyakla speaking quietly in their own language. He could hear one of the children laughing at something, a sound that brought back memories of Samuel and Mary so vivid that his chest ached. He could hear the women singing softly as they worked, a haunting melody that spoke of loss and hope intertwined. Thomas closed his eyes and let the sounds wash over him. For 15 years, he had lived in silence, surrounded only by the emptiness of his own grief. Now, suddenly, his world was full of voices again, full of life, full of people who needed him. It terrified him. It exhilarated him. It made him feel human again in a way he had forgotten was possible. Whatever happened next, Thomas knew that his life would never be the same. The walls he had built around his heart were crumbling, and he found that he did not want to rebuild them. For the first time in 15 years, he wanted to live, really live, not just survive. The desert night was quiet around him, peaceful and vast and full of stars. Somewhere in that darkness, soldiers were searching for the people sleeping on his land. Danger was coming, sooner or later. Thomas knew he should be afraid. But, as he drifted off to sleep, all he felt was a strange, unexpected sense of peace. He was not alone anymore. whatever came next, he would not face it alone. And somehow, that made all the difference. 3 days after the Apaches arrived at his ranch, Thomas led them to the hidden canyon he had spoken of. They traveled at night, when the darkness would hide their movements from any watching eyes. The journey was slow and careful, with Thomas in the lead and Goyakla bringing up the rear, both men alert for any sign of danger. The canyon entrance was exactly as Thomas had described it, a narrow gap between two towering rock walls that was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. From a distance, it appeared to be just another shadow on the face of the cliff, nothing remarkable, nothing worth investigating. But once you slipped through that narrow gap, the canyon opened up into a wide, sheltered valley that stretched back into the mountain for nearly a mile. Thomas had discovered this place years ago, during one of his long explorations of the land surrounding his ranch. He had been searching for stray cattle that had wandered off during a storm and had stumbled upon the entrance quite by accident. Since then, he had used the canyon as a refuge during the worst weather, a place where his animals could shelter from the violent thunderstorms that sometimes swept across the desert. Now, it would serve a different purpose. As the Apaches filed through the narrow entrance and saw the valley beyond, Thomas heard gasps of amazement from several of them. The canyon floor was relatively flat and covered with grass that had grown lush thanks to a small stream that trickled down from the rocks above. There was shade from the canyon walls, which rose high enough to block the worst of the summer sun. And, at the far end, a natural cave opened into the rock face, providing shelter that would keep them hidden even if someone managed to find the canyon entrance. "This is good," Desodehe said, his voice filled with quiet approval. "Very good. We could live here for months without being found." Thomas nodded. "That's the idea. I've got supplies stockpiled in the cave from the last time I used it during storm season. Dried food, water barrels, blankets, tools. It's not much, but it should keep you going while you recover your strength." The Apaches wasted no time in exploring their new home. The children ran ahead, delighted by the open space after days of hiding and moving carefully. The adults spread out, examining the terrain, locating water sources, identifying the best spots for shelter and defense. Thomas watched them work, impressed as always by their efficiency and their deep understanding of how to survive in harsh environments. Over the next few weeks, the hidden canyon was transformed into a proper camp. The Apaches built shelters using materials they gathered from the surrounding land, simple structures of branches and brush that blended into the landscape and would be almost impossible to spot from above. They dug fire pits designed to disperse smoke, making it nearly invisible against the sky. They established routines for hunting and gathering, supplementing the supplies Thomas had provided with fresh game and wild plants. Thomas found himself spending more and more time in the canyon rather than at his ranch. He told himself it was practical, that he needed to help the Apaches get settled and teach them the lay of the land. But the truth was simpler than that. For the first time in 15 years, he had found a place where he felt he belonged. His days fell into a new pattern. In the mornings, he would hunt with Goyakla and some of the other men, tracking deer and rabbits through the desert and mountains. Despite his wounded arm, Goyakla proved to be an exceptional hunter, able to move through the brush without making a sound, and hit his targets with remarkable accuracy using only a bow and arrow. Thomas, who had always considered himself a decent hunter, felt like a clumsy amateur in comparison. In the afternoons, he would help with the camp's maintenance, repairing shelters, reinforcing defenses, expanding the storage cave. The physical work felt good after so many years of solitary labor. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside others, about seeing the fruits of collective effort rather than just his own. In the evenings, he would sit with the group around their carefully concealed fire and listen to stories. The Apaches had a rich tradition of oral history, and Desodehe in particular was a gifted storyteller. He spoke of the old days, before the white men came, when the Apache roamed freely across the land that had been theirs for generations beyond counting. He told tales of great warriors and wise leaders, of battles won and lost, of the spirits that lived in the mountains and the rivers and the sky. Thomas found these stories fascinating, offering a perspective on the land he had lived in for 15 years that he had never considered before. To him, the Arizona territory had always been empty, unpopulated, a blank slate on which white settlers could write their own history. But, through Desodehe's stories, he began to understand that this land had never been empty. It had been home to a people with their own culture, their own traditions, their own relationship with the earth that went back further than Thomas could imagine. The children, too, began to warm to him. Little Lozen had adopted Thomas as something like a grandfather, following him everywhere and peppering him with questions about everything she saw. At first, the language barrier made communication difficult, but Lozen was a quick learner, and Thomas found himself picking up Apache words and phrases faster than he would have believed possible. Before long, they had developed their own hybrid language, a mixture of English and Apache peppered with hand gestures and facial expressions that somehow allowed them to understand each other perfectly. Dakia, the 10-year-old boy, proved to be intensely interested in Thomas's horses and cattle. He had never seen domesticated animals before, and he spent hours watching them, trying to understand their behavior and their relationship with Thomas. Eventually, Thomas began teaching him the basics of animal husbandry, showing him how to care for horses, how to identify signs of illness, how to gentle a skittish colt. Dakia absorbed this knowledge with the same intensity his ancestors had brought to learning the ways of wild animals. The twin girls, Alope and Hakali, were shyer than their siblings, but they too eventually found ways to connect with Thomas. They were fascinated by his house and the strange objects it contained, things they had never seen before like books and clocks and the small music box Margaret had brought with her from the East all those years ago. Thomas let them explore, answering their questions as best he could, and was surprised by how much he enjoyed showing them his world. But it was his relationship with Ishka, Desodahe's wife, that affected Thomas most deeply. As her wound healed and her strength returned, Ishka proved to be a woman of remarkable capability and wisdom. She ran the daily operations of the camp with quiet authority, organizing work, settling disputes, ensuring that everyone was fed and cared for. She reminded Thomas powerfully of Margaret, not in appearance, but in that same combination of strength and gentleness that had made his wife so special. One evening, perhaps a month after the Apaches had arrived, Thomas sat alone by the stream that ran through the canyon floor. He was lost in thought, his mind wandering through memories of his family that had become less painful over the weeks of his new life. He did not hear Ishka approach until she sat down beside him. "You think of them often," she said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded slowly. "My wife and children. They died a long time ago. My husband told me." Ishka's voice was soft, sympathetic. "He said that you carry great sorrow inside you." "I've carried it for 15 years, Thomas admitted. "I thought it would never get any lighter. And now?" Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "It's strange," he said finally. "I still miss them. I'll always miss them. But lately, it doesn't hurt quite as much. Being around your people, being around the children, it's like I'm remembering what it feels like to be part of something again." Ishka nodded, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Grief is heavy when we carry it alone. But when we share our lives with others, the weight becomes easier to bear. I'm starting to understand that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars reflect off the surface of the stream. Then, Ishka spoke again. "We talk about you, you know. My husband, and I, the others. We wonder why you chose to help us." Thomas shrugged. "I've told Desodahe. I've seen enough death. I didn't want to cause more." "That is what you say? But we wonder if there is more to it than that." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "When you came to my ranch, when I saw those children stumbling toward my door, I felt something I hadn't felt in 15 years. I felt like I had a purpose again. Like maybe my life could mean something beyond just existing until I died." Ishka reached out and placed her hand on his arm. The gesture was gentle, comforting, and Thomas felt his eyes sting with tears he had not shed in longer than he could remember. "You are a good man, Thomas Clearwater," Ishka said. "A good man who has suffered greatly and emerged with his heart still intact. Such men are rare in any people. We are fortunate that you found us, and we found you." Thomas could not speak. The emotions swelling inside him were too powerful for words. But he covered Ishka's hand with his own and squeezed gently, and that simple gesture said everything that needed to be said. The weeks turned into months, and summer faded into fall. The days grew shorter and cooler, and the landscape began to change from the harsh browns and yellows of summer to the softer tones of autumn. Thomas's ranch continued to operate, though now he had help. Goyakla and several of the other Apache men would accompany him on trips to check on the cattle and maintain the property, always careful to watch for any sign of soldiers or other outsiders. The arrangement had developed into something resembling a partnership. The Apaches helped Thomas with his work, and, in return, Thomas shared his resources and his knowledge. He taught them about ranching and farming, skills that might prove useful if they ever found a place where they could settle permanently. They taught him hunting and tracking and survival skills that made him more capable in the wilderness than he had ever been before. But they also shared something deeper than practical knowledge. They shared stories and songs and laughter. They shared meals eaten around the fire as the sun went down. They shared the experience of building something together, of creating a community where none had existed before. Thomas found himself changing in ways he could not have predicted. The hard shell he had built around himself over 15 years of solitude was cracking, falling away piece by piece. He smiled more than he had in years. He laughed at the children's antics, joined in the men's friendly competitions, listened with genuine interest as the women shared their knowledge of plants and medicine. One evening, as he sat with DeSoto watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, the Apache leader spoke of something he had been thinking about for some time. "We cannot stay here forever," DeSoto said. "You know this." Thomas nodded slowly. He had been avoiding this conversation, not wanting to think about the day when his new family would have to leave. "I know. The soldiers will eventually give up their search, or they will be sent elsewhere. When that happens, we must decide what to do. Where to go. Have you thought about it?" DeSoto was quiet for a moment. "There are Apache bands in Mexico who might take us in. The Sierra Madre Mountains, far to the south. It is a hard journey, many weeks through dangerous country. But it may be our best chance for a life where we are not hunted." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Mexico, that was hundreds of miles away, across some of the harshest terrain in North America. The journey would be dangerous, exhausting, potentially deadly. And, at the end of it, even if they survived, he would never see any of them again. "When?" he asked, his voice rough. "Not yet. Winter is coming, and we are not strong enough for such a journey in the cold. We will wait until spring, when the weather improves, and we have had more time to prepare." DeSoto paused, then added quietly, "You could come with us." Thomas's head snapped around to stare at the older man. "What? You could come with us to Mexico. Start a new life there, away from everything you have known." DeSoto's dark eyes met Thomas's steadily. "You have become one of us, Thomas Clearwater. The children love you. The adults respect you. You are part of our family now, whether you intended it or not. If you wish to remain with us, you would be welcome." Thomas was speechless. The idea had never occurred to him. And yet the moment DeSoto spoke the words, Thomas felt a strange surge of longing. To leave everything behind. To travel with these people who had become his family. To start over in a new land where his past did not matter. But, even as the longing rose in him, reality crashed down upon it. He was an old man, at least by the standards of the frontier. He had lived in Arizona for 15 years, and before that in Missouri. He knew nothing of Mexico, nothing of the Apache bands who lived there, nothing of the challenges he would face in a foreign land. "I appreciate the offer," Thomas said slowly. "More than you know. But I'm too old for that kind of journey. I'd slow you down, maybe get you killed." "That is not true, and you know it," DeSoto replied. "You are stronger than many men half your age. You have survived in this desert for 15 years alone. You would not slow us down." Thomas shook his head. "It's not just that. This is my home, DeSoto. I've built a life here, such as it is. I'm not sure I could leave it, even for your people." DeSoto nodded, accepting this without argument. "I understand. But the offer remains open. You have until spring to decide." They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky, and the stars began to appear. Thomas's mind was racing, turning over possibilities and consequences, weighing options he had never thought he would have to consider. Leave Arizona? Leave his ranch, his cattle, his solitary life? It seemed impossible. And yet, as he looked up at the stars, Thomas found himself imagining what it would be like to see those same stars from a different place. To sit around a fire in the Sierra Madre Mountains, surrounded by the people who had brought him back to life. To grow old among friends rather than alone in the desert. The thought was terrifying, and beautiful, and utterly beyond anything Thomas Clearwater had ever imagined for himself. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself thinking about DeSoto's offer more and more. He did not discuss it with anyone, keeping his thoughts to himself as he went about his daily routines. But the idea was there, in the back of his mind, growing slowly like a seed planted in fertile soil. One morning in late October, Thomas was working at his ranch, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a storm. He was alone, the Apaches remaining in the hidden canyon for safety while he tended to business that required him to be visible at his property. Shadow lay nearby, dozing in the autumn sunshine. The sound of approaching horses made Thomas straighten up and reach for the rifle that was never far from his side. He shaded his eyes against the sun and watched as two figures on horseback emerged from the heat haze that still shimmered over the land despite the cooler weather. As they drew closer, Thomas could make out their uniforms. Cavalry soldiers, wearing the blue coats of the United States Army. His heart began to pound, but he forced himself to remain calm. They were just two men, probably on routine patrol. There was no reason to panic. The soldiers reined in their horses a few yards from where Thomas stood. One of them, a young lieutenant with a carefully groomed mustache, tipped his hat. "Good morning, sir. I'm Lieutenant Edwards, and this is Sergeant Miller. We're from Fort Apache, conducting a sweep of the area." Thomas nodded politely. "Morning. What brings you out this way?" "We're looking for a group of escaped Apache," the lieutenant said. 10 of them fled from a transport detail about 3 months ago. They were spotted heading in this direction, and we've been searching the area ever since. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, but his expression remained neutral. "Apache, you say? Can't say I've seen any around here. But then, I don't get out much." Lieutenant Edwards studied him for a moment, his eyes taking in Thomas's weathered appearance, his solitary ranch, his evident comfort with the isolation. "You live out here alone?" "Have for 15 years, Thomas replied. "Prefer it that way. Haven't noticed anything unusual lately? Tracks, signs of campfires, anything like that?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary. But, like I said, I keep to myself mostly. Don't venture too far from the ranch." The lieutenant seemed to accept this. He glanced around at the sparse landscape, the distant mountains, the endless expanse of desert. "It's remote country out here, that's for sure. Hard to search properly." "That it is," Thomas agreed. Lieutenant Edwards pulled a piece of paper from his saddlebag and handed it down to Thomas. "This is a description of the Apaches we're looking for. If you see anything at all, we'd appreciate it if you would report to the nearest army post." Thomas took the paper and glanced at it. The descriptions were vague, generic, the kind of thing written by someone who thought all Apaches looked alike. But there were a few specific details that made his blood run cold. An older man with gray hair, traveling with his wife and son. For children, including a young girl of about 5 years old. "I'll keep an eye out," Thomas said, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "Is there anything else?" The lieutenant shook his head. "No, that's all. We'll be moving on. Good day to you, sir." Thomas watched as the two soldiers turned their horses and rode away, heading south toward the distant trading post. He stood there until they were out of sight, then let out a long, shaky breath. They were still searching. 3 months later, and the army was still looking for DeSoto and his people. The search was not over. The danger had not passed. Thomas gathered his tools and began the journey back to the hidden canyon, his mind churning with worry. He needed to warn the others. They needed to be even more careful now, more vigilant. The soldiers were close, too close, and if they found the canyon, everything would be lost. As he walked, Thomas found himself making a decision he had been avoiding for weeks. When spring came, when DeSoto and his people set out for Mexico, he would go with them. He could not stay here, knowing that soldiers were searching the area, knowing that at any moment they might find the people who had become his family. It was time to leave Arizona. It was time to start a new life. The thought no longer terrified him. As Thomas walked through the desert toward the hidden canyon, toward the people waiting for him there, he felt something he had not felt in 15 years. He felt free. Winter came to the Arizona territory with a fury that surprised even those who had lived there for years. Snow fell in the mountains, and cold winds swept down across the desert, bringing temperatures that plunged below freezing during the long nights. Thomas had seen harsh winters before, but this one seemed particularly brutal, as if nature itself was testing them. The hidden canyon proved to be an excellent refuge during these difficult months. The high walls blocked the worst of the wind, and the cave at the far end provided shelter that kept them warm even when ice formed on the stream. Thomas had stockpiled plenty of firewood before the cold set in, and the hunting expeditions they had conducted throughout the fall had left them with enough dried meat to last until spring. Still, it was a challenging time. The children grew restless, unable to play freely in the frozen landscape. The adults worked constantly to maintain their shelters and keep the fire burning. And always, in the back of everyone's mind, was the knowledge that soldiers were still searching for them, that danger lurked beyond the canyon walls. Thomas found himself growing closer to the Apache during these long winter months. The enforced proximity of their shelter meant that there was no escaping one another, and the conversations that grew from this closeness deepened his understanding of these people he had come to care for so deeply. He learned about their beliefs, their understanding of the world, and their place in it. The Apache saw themselves as part of the natural world, not separate from it or superior to it. They believed that everything in creation had a spirit, that mountains and rivers and animals and plants were all connected in a web of life that humans were part of. This perspective was so different from the Christian worldview Thomas had been raised with that it took him months to truly understand it. But once he did, he found a strange comfort in it. The idea that he was connected to everything around him, that he was not alone in a vast and indifferent universe, spoke to something deep inside him. He learned about their history, not just the recent conflicts with white settlers, but the generations that had come before. The Apache had lived in this land for hundreds of years, developing a culture perfectly suited to the harsh desert environment. They had survived droughts and floods, wars and famines, adapting and enduring through it all. The current crisis, terrible as it was just the latest in a long series of challenges they had faced and overcome. He learned about their hopes for the future. Despite everything they had suffered, despite the losses they had endured, the Apache refused to give up. They dreamed of a time when they could live in peace, when their children could grow up without fear, when their culture could flourish again. It was this hope that kept them going, that gave them the strength to survive each difficult day. And Thomas learned about himself. Through his conversations with Soulful and Ishka, through his interactions with the children and the other adults, he came to understand things about his own life that he had never fully grasped before. He understood now that his years of solitude had been a form of slow suicide. By cutting himself off from human connection, he had been killing himself just as surely as if he had put a gun to his head. The only difference was that his death had been gradual, a long, slow fading rather than a sudden end. He understood that his grief over Margaret and the children, while natural and understandable, had become a prison of his own making. He had used it as an excuse to withdraw from life, to avoid the risk of caring about anyone or anything ever again. In doing so, he had dishonored the memory of the people he had lost. Margaret would never have wanted him to spend the rest of his life in misery. She would have wanted him to find happiness again, to love again, to live again. He understood that the Apaches had saved his life just as surely as he had saved theirs. They had given him a reason to keep going, a purpose beyond mere survival. They had reminded him what it felt like to be part of a family, to care about others, and be cared for in return. Without them, he would have continued his slow fade into nothingness, dying alone in the desert with nothing to show for his years of existence. These realizations came to Thomas gradually over the winter months, emerging from the long hours of conversation and reflection that the season forced upon them. By the time the first hints of spring began to appear, he felt like a different man than the one who had watched 10 desperate Apaches stumble toward his ranch all those months ago. The decision to accompany them to Mexico was no longer a question. It was simply a fact, as certain and unshakable as the mountains that surrounded the canyon. Thomas would leave Arizona. He would travel with his new family across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. He would start a new life in a new land, surrounded by people who had become more precious to him than anything he owned. When he finally told Soulful of his decision, the Apache leader simply nodded, as if he had known all along what Thomas would choose. "You have been one of us since the day you lowered your rifle and offered us water," Soulful said. "This is just making official what was already true." The preparations for the journey began in earnest as winter loosened its grip on the land. There was much to do. They needed supplies for a trip that would take many weeks. They needed to plan their route carefully, avoiding military posts and settlements where they might be spotted. They needed to make sure everyone was strong enough for the hard travel ahead. Thomas made several trips to the trading post, purchasing supplies he would need for the journey. He was careful to spread his purchases over time, buying a little here and a little there, so as not to arouse suspicion. The trader asked no questions, probably assuming that Thomas was simply stocking up for another year of solitary life on his ranch. One day in early March, Thomas was returning from one such trip when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks on the trail, the marks of many horses traveling in formation. Soldiers. And they were heading in the direction of his ranch. Thomas urged his horse to greater speed, his heart pounding with fear. Had the soldiers found the canyon? Were the Apaches in danger? He pushed his mount as hard as he dared, racing across the desert landscape with a desperation he had not felt in years. When he crested the rise that looked down upon his ranch, he pulled his horse to a stop and stared at the scene below. There were at least a dozen soldiers gathered around his house, their horses tied to the fence of the corral. An officer was standing on his porch, and as Thomas watched, several soldiers emerged from inside his house, shaking their heads. They were searching his property, looking for signs of the escaped Apaches, looking for evidence that Thomas had been harboring fugitives. Thomas forced himself to remain calm. He had been careful. There was nothing in his house that would connect him to the Apaches. No Apache belongings, no evidence of additional people living on the property. As long as he kept his head, he could get through this. He rode down toward the ranch, making no attempt to hide his approach. The soldiers spotted him quickly, and several of them drew their weapons, but the officer on the porch held up a hand to stop them. As Thomas drew closer, he recognized the officer. It was Lieutenant Edwards, the same man who had questioned him months earlier.